Hi, everyone. I'm Tracy Osborne, Associate Professor at UC Merced, Director of the UC Center for Climate Justice, and your instructor for this module on climate justice for tropical forests. For today's lecture, we will hear from experts in the field of carbon offsets. Increasingly, companies, institutions, state agencies, and many universities are aiming to achieve net zero emissions or to be carbon neutral, and in doing so are purchasing carbon offsets. Individuals also purchase carbon offsets to reduce their carbon footprints, which are unavoidable in our currently highly industrialized, fossil fuel intensive society. So what are carbon offsets? A carbon offset is a reduction of carbon emissions or other greenhouse gases measured in carbon dioxide equivalents. Offsets are generated from projects or programs that are intended to compensate for emissions made elsewhere. Because greenhouse gases mix in the atmosphere freely, the logic is that it doesn't matter where reductions take place. So say an entity sets a goal to be carbon neutral. It will make as many reductions on site as possible through renewable energy, energy efficiency, and sustainable land use activities. For any additional reductions not possible or too expensive to make on site, carbon offsets can be purchased from a variety of activities, including forest projects anywhere in the world. Avoiding deforestation prevents emissions, and both planting trees and supporting forest restoration sequesters and stores carbon. So forests are considered an important area for climate change mitigation. The buying and selling of carbon offsets take place on carbon markets. While carbon offsets intend to address the climate crisis at low cost and flexible ways, they have received a lot of criticism over the years, particularly those in forest ecosystems. Our speakers today have a lot of experience with carbon offsets and are working to identify and develop high quality projects. So our speakers, in the order that they will present, are Barbara Haya, Director of the Berkeley Carbon Trading Project at the University of California, Berkeley; Elizabeth Shapiro Garza, Associate Professor of the Practice at Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment; and Jerry Toth, co-founder of TMA, or the Third Millennium Alliance, heading the Community Reforestation Program in coastal Ecuador, and is also co-founder of TOAC, a fair trade Ecuadorian dark chocolate company. Following their presentations, I'll pose a set of questions for discussion. So our first speaker is Dr. Barbara Haya. Barbara is director of the Berkeley Carbon Trading Project at the University of California, Berkeley's Goldman School of Public Policy. Her research focuses on the outcomes and environmental quality of carbon offset programs. Barbara is also helping the University of California system develop its strategy for procuring carbon offsets for use toward the system's carbon neutrality goal. Barbara holds a PhD from UC Berkeley's Energy and Resources Group. Barbara, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tracy. And I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation. The University of California system of 10 campuses brought me on to help them figure out their strategy for procuring carbon offsets, given the quality challenges of offsets on the market. And for this work, I sometimes talk to administrators in UC budget offices, and I sometimes have a chance to talk to members of forest communities living deep in the Amazon. And what connects these two very different communities is the carbon offset credit. And as you said, Tracy, as more and more companies and universities take on carbon neutrality goals, offsets are seen as having a tremendous opportunity to generate funds for climate mitigation activities, and especially for programs that slow tropical deforestation. Around half of all of the credits on the market today that the universities and companies and others are able to buy are from forests, and most of those are from tropical forests, either tree planting or sustainable forest management, or programs that support communities and governments to reduce deforestation. So I think a key question of our discussion today is if and how offsetting can live up to the promise of being an important funder of efforts to reduce tropical deforestation. And I want to highlight three challenges with offsets. And one is, looking at the UC offset program and budget offices, the offsets have allowed UC to take on a very deep climate target, carbon neutrality by 2025. We wouldn't have been able to do it without the ability to meet it in part by buying inexpensive offset credits. But then on the other hand, the availability of inexpensive offset credits also makes it harder for budget offices to make the difficult decision to pay the higher cost of directly reducing our emissions, electrifying our campuses, getting off of natural gas, electrifying our vehicle fleets. So it plays both roles. And the second challenge, so I've studied offset quality for 20 years, and I found, and others have found, that most offset credits available in the market don't represent real emissions reductions. So offsets in this way can reduce overall action by trading real action to reduce direct emissions with false credits. And perhaps most problematic is that it allows us all to believe that we're doing a lot more to reduce our carbon emissions than we're actually doing. And that's really a problem given the small and shrinking global carbon emissions budget. And third, by creating a trade in abstracted carbon credits, in treating all carbon reduced, all of these credits from all of these different types of projects as equal, and it creates an incentive only for carbon, which can lead to adverse outcomes when a more holistic planned approach is really needed that takes into account short-term greenhouse gas emissions as well as many other factors. And this is especially difficult or a problem in places with large imbalances of power, with tenuous land tenure, like deep in tropical forests. So I want to talk a little bit more about the quality challenges and the reason for them, and then what the University of California is doing to address those. So the quality challenges I see as being core two different challenges. So the registries that are writing the rules of what projects are allowed to participate and how the emissions reductions or removals are estimated from those projects are creating programs focused on creating an incentive to allow in lots of new projects and lots of to create an effective incentive for climate mitigation that needs incentives. But there are two challenges. One is that when these registries allow in any wind project, any improved forest management project, some of the participating projects are going to be projects that would have gone ahead anyway. And some of them are new and really incentivized by the program. And what the registries aren't doing, or what they are doing, is they're treating all of those projects as similar. Everyone's allowed to generate credits as if they're new and caused by the program. And in this way, the program is overestimating its impact on emissions by crediting those projects that would have gone ahead anyway, and by crediting its real impact on emissions and incentivizing new projects. And research has shown that it's really the majority of, or from different programs, that it can be the majority of projects that are non-additional. And then the second is that when estimating or writing the rules of how to estimate emissions reductions, the registries are also overestimating or creating rules that lead to exaggerated emissions reductions. And I believe that the reason why this is still happening after 20 years of offsetting is that the entities that are writing the rules and everyone that's involved in the offset program, the buyers, the sellers, buyers that want cheap credits, the sellers that want more credits, the third-party verifiers that are hired to audit the projects want to be hired again, and the registries themselves benefit from, like, all of these actors benefit from more credits and therefore poor quality credits. So the question is, what is the University of California doing given this? And our approach is really twofold. One, we're doing research on the quality of offsets on the market, shining a bright light, like doing this in-depth research on what's really happening on the ground. How can the protocols and the registries tighten up their rules? And what is safe to buy? What is safe for the University of California to buy? And then putting that out there for generally guidance for buyers. And in these ways, hoping to push the whole market, but at least to provide buyers more information about what's okay to buy and what's not. And then I think what we're all at University of California most excited about is we've implemented a program for developing our own projects, where the idea there is, if the key challenge is additionality and knowing that you're really making a difference and not just paying for what would have happened anyway, the best thing to do is build our own projects, because then we know that we're making a difference. And then we can also make sure that we're estimating emissions reductions in a way that is based on the best science. And then lastly, what we're doing by doing this is, instead of taking funds and sending them off campus to pay others to do projects, we're reinvesting in ourselves, investing in research project or implementation projects that come out of university research, supporting, involving students in these projects. And so what we did is we put out a call for ideas from the whole university community, and we ended up supporting 12 pilot projects. Each project is, we hope will be expanded to a full-scale university-supported offset project that will be a core or a large share of our offset needs. And half of those projects are in the US, half of those projects are international. And I want to highlight two international projects. One is a reforestation project in Mexico, much like the work that Liz is working on. And one is an avoided deforestation project supporting the work of an indigenous community in Ecuador, much like the work that Jerry is doing. And Tracy, I'm so excited that you're involved in that project as well. So let me pass it back on to you, Tracy.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for providing a great summary of what the UC is doing, which is really important work. And I'm thrilled to be part of that. So our next speaker is Dr. Elizabeth Shapiro Garza. Elizabeth is an associate professor of the practice of environmental policy and management at the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University. She is also director of the Certificate in Community-Based Environmental Management. Liz's research focuses on market-based environmental initiatives and policies in Latin America, their social and environmental impacts, and their intersection with development projects and goals at multiple scales. She received her doctorate from the University of California, Berkeley, and her master's degree from Yale University. Thanks so much, Liz. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Tracy. It is such a pleasure to be with you all, and to whoever is listening, to be with you as well. So I'm going to be talking today about a project that I have been involved with since 2005 with a group of indigenous communities in Oaxaca, Mexico. And actually the connection to that project with Duke University. And I think it builds really nicely on what Barbara was discussing previously. Duke University has taken a very similar approach to what Barbara was describing in supporting carbon offsetting and utilizing carbon offsetting. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Maybe we can get more into the conversation later. I'm just going to share a PowerPoint so that you all can see some images from the project itself, especially. So let me just switch over. So the project, as I mentioned, is a forest-based carbon offset project in Oaxaca, Mexico. And it is, sorry about that. Just to give a little bit of context about forest-based carbon offsetting in Mexico, Mexico has been an incredibly enthusiastic player in the global market for climate change mitigation through greenhouse gas sequestration. So there are a number of subnational offsetting initiatives. There's a national payment for carbon sequestration program that was in operation from 2006 to 2010. And there's also a number of REDD Plus and Governor's Forest and Climate Task Force projects that were implemented as well. And I'm sure you've heard about that in the previous portion of the course. But also, one of the interesting things about Mexico is that 60% of the forest land is owned communally by smallholders. Tenure is very strong. So they actually do have, for the most part, very strong rights over their property. And for that reason, anything that involves forest management, including forest-based carbon offsets, must work with forest-based communities and at the community level. However, given all of this interest in forest-based carbon offsetting in Mexico, there have been many failures and very few success stories. And again, however you want to measure success or failure, a lot of projects that were started and attempted and never went through. So just to give you a sense of where I'll be talking, the region I'll be talking about, Oaxaca is located on the southwest coast of Mexico. And you can see in the map as well where the projects that I will be talking about are located. These are indigenous communities that are in indigenous territories throughout the state of Oaxaca, but they form one particular organization. To give you a sense of the political context as well, which is important, I think, for understanding particularly the justice implications for this case, is that it is highly mountainous state. There are two different mountain ranges that go through the state, but with very high rates of deforestation. 80% of the territory is actually under communal ownership as well. And that's owned by both indigenous and campesino communities. And there are 16 distinct indigenous groups. And one thing to know as well about the state of Oaxaca is that it's common to hear indigenous groups talking about the fact that nunca fuimos conquistados, which means that we were never conquered. So there's a very strong sense of identity, a very strong sense of territorial control in a lot of the indigenous communities that we're talking about. And I know Barbara had mentioned the issues of lack of strong land tenure being a problem in many different types of forest-based conservation and forest-based offsetting. That's not so much of an issue in this case, and that's important to note. There's very strong civil society as well. So the case I'm talking about, though, is an organization called the Integrator of Indigenous and Campesino Communities of Oaxaca, ICICO. It was a civil society organization that was formed by 6 Oaxacan NGOs or nonprofit organizations in 2000 to support 12 rural communities. And their mandate was to promote the provision and sale of ecosystem services derived from these communities, sustainable management of their territories. Between 2000 and 2007, and it's important to note, I think this kind of background is that they had a very long period in which to develop their forest management and their forest carbon offsetting program, and a lot of support, external support in doing so. So they had a really a long period in actually being able to develop this program in the way that made sense for them. So they actually selected the communities they were working with by forest type, that the land use that were in those communities was compatible with the conservation of forest and the production of ecosystem services, particularly carbon, and that they had strong and functional governance so that they really were very well organized and could act collectively. They had participatory planning and development of these projects. So there was enormous involvement and very lengthy involvement of these communities in planning for how they wanted to manage their forest for ecosystem services. And they had 8 years of non-market funding and technical support to develop the program, which is also incredibly important. They and external funders, university support was all provided for developing the projects. You can see actually here that one of the things I think that's really unusual about this project as a forest-based offsetting project is that there's a very, very strong level of governance and oversight by the communities themselves in how the project has been developed, but also how it's managed. They actually have, in replicating some of the indigenous governance structure, they actually have an oversight committee of community representatives that provides oversight for the financial aspects, but also the technical aspects and the management of the forest-based carbon offsetting project itself. And that really does provide very strong input and participation by the communities themselves. So they actually, one of the things that's really remarkable about this case is that they created a market for forest-based carbon offsets within Mexico. They worked with a civil society organization or a nonprofit that is very well known, a national nonprofit called Pro Natura in Mexico. And they created a national level voluntary offset market called Neutralízate, which means neutralize yourself, which sounds funny in English, but not so much in Spanish. It was marketed, their carbon offsets were marketed in this case as Carboin, which meant indigenous water and biodiversity carbon. And one thing I think that's really important to note and goes back to what Barbara was talking about as well, is they conceived of their model as relationship carbon. So they actually were, a lot of what that means is that there's a lot of trust involved between Pro Natura as the kind of manager of the market itself and the communities themselves. And a lot of trust within Mexico for Pro Natura. So the fact that Pro Natura was saying these are valid and successful additional carbon offsets was taken at face value by the buyers in a lot of cases that we talked to. And they also were able, that allowed them, with that level of trust, they were allowed to develop their own offsetting protocol. So ICICO actually developed the protocol based on a number of different protocols that were in operation at that time. There was no independent verification. There was a very high level of payment, $10 per ton of CO2 equivalents. And they had annual contracts, so these were renewable over time. Just quickly to say, one of the other things that's really striking, I think, and as a result of the long period of investment that went into developing these projects, the high level of participation, and the ability of that was allowed because it was relationship carbon, and there was a high level of trust. That it really allowed these communities to develop the ways in which they wanted to offset carbon that was in ways that were compatible with their existing land uses and livelihoods. So that included sustainable timber production, degraded forest land, natural regeneration, agricultural lands that were then, the management was changed in ways that would offset carbon, and carbon agroforestry. And then they also had included a really wide variety of activities that, again, were compatible with their management practices, existing management practices, and desires for how they wanted to manage their land. Just quickly, again, from 2014 to the present, they actually have managed to link with international markets as well. So they linked with the California Climate Action Reserve voluntary offset market starting in 2014, although there was a long period of development for that process. They worked with CAR, the California Action Reserve, and American National Standards Institute, ANSI, to develop the first protocols in Mexico for carbon offsetting, forest-based carbon offsetting, which was in talking to the folks who actually worked to develop that within ICICO, they described that as a learning process between ANSI and ICICO in developing those protocols. So they really felt as if they had a very strong say in how those protocols were developed, and which meant then what was counted and what wasn't, and how the types of management practices that were going to be allowed. Just to say that it has, the Neutralízate market has, as of 2018, had sequestered over 200,000 carbon equivalent or carbon CO2 equivalent carbon offsets. And in the California market, as of 2019, again, it's a much smaller period, over 23,000. And just to give a couple different pieces of information too about the kind of co-benefits. These are what are seen as the benefits to the people who are involved in the project. 85% of the offset funds that they've received thus far have been reinvested into the project itself. But that has actually meant not just that it went back into forest management, but that it went to pay for labor. So people were being employed by the project, and that they were also receiving benefits otherwise as well. They used partial of the funds to develop different projects within the communities that the communities had decided that they wanted to develop, including ecotourism, water bottling plants, timber management, community conserved areas, non-timber forest projects, and also provided direct employment for long-term employment in monitoring and verification, but also short-term employment in management activities, which has been huge, especially for people who need seasonal employment, or they would have to migrate to the cities to do so. They also have received, in talking to and interviewing people who are involved in the project, they also perceive that they have received local ecosystem service benefits by the changing in management, forest management practices, including rainwater retention, improved water quality, increased wildlife, scenic beauty, local climate control, and social benefits, including capacity building, educational opportunities, diminished out-migration, especially from those short-term employment opportunities, positive empowering interactions with external actors, and pride. A lot of pride expressed in these projects. The last thing I'll say is just that I think one of the important parts that of their approach to forest-based carbon offsetting, is that it was culturally embedded. And there's lots of different ways to talk about this and think about it. But they really framed this project and the forest-based carbon offsetting that they were doing in their own cultural context. Part of that was that it was framed as a recognition by people who are buying offsets of the services provided through traditional forest stewardship. So as opposed to paying someone a bad actor to not deforest, they saw that as a recognition of their good management. Also, that it was framed as compensation, so that denotes valuable, complex relationship between two parties, that this was a relationship-based approach, that they saw this as being a relationship between them and the people who are buying the offsets. And it built on existing land management practices, including land use and livelihood strategies, forest management practices, governance structures and land tenure rights, and communal benefits and labor. I'll stop there, and I very much look forward to our conversation.
Thanks so much, Liz. Yeah, that's a really important case of Mexico's experience with climate change mitigation and the important role of Indigenous people. So thank you for that. So our final speaker today will be Jerry Toth. So for the past 15 years, Jerry has been implementing reforestation and agroforestry projects in Ecuador. Jerry is co-founder of TMA, or the Third Millennium Alliance, and helped build the Hama Coake Ecological Reserve in coastal Ecuador and leads TMA's community reforestation program. His work with cacao in particular led him to co-found TOAC, an Ecuadorian dark chocolate company that pays cacao growers the highest prices in the world. His work has been featured in Forbes, National Geographic, Fortune magazine, LA Times, and Vice magazine, among others. And he has degrees from the London School of Economics and Cornell University. Jerry, I'll now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tracy. And also thanks, Liz and Barbara. I feel like I've just learned a lot the last 20 minutes. Thank you for sharing. I think what I'd like to talk about here is just kind of go through our journey in developing this project and talk about the three main barriers that we faced and our strategies to overcome those barriers. We started experimenting with reforestation, agroforestry many years ago, about 15 years ago, and we've been trying different techniques over those years. And we've also tried to work with the communities that surround the reserve in different ways. And our goal was always we work in this area that's been extremely deforested, severe rates of deforestation. How can we begin the task of regenerating at least a good part of what's been lost, and how can we involve people in the communities in that process in a way that is beneficial for them, not only ecologically but also economically? That's kind of the main problem that we faced. In the past, we tried to simply, we experimented with different incentives in terms of, we can provide seedlings, we can provide, we can provide workshops, we can provide technical assistance. And that didn't really work. It didn't really move the needle because most people here are living week to week at in some cases day to day. And so the main barrier we faced was just, barrier to entry, barrier to participation in this project. So we finally realized that the only way to really make this work is to incorporate payment for ecosystem services, to actually provide payments for for local farmers, for people in the area to reforest their own deforested land. Without that payment, it just wasn't getting done. People didn't see a reason to join. It requires work to change your method of cultivation. It requires, in some cases, this is fallow land. It would only be slash and burned every few years for corn, and that was it. And so switching to a new method requires work, all the work of maintaining and irrigating trees and plants, and it's not a full-time job, but it's a serious job. And so the big thing for us is, okay, we need to actually, people need to be paid for this. This is a service, and really thinking of it in those terms. The term payment for ecosystem services it's a great term. Actually, it's very descriptive of what this is. And when we work with people, we try to frame it like that. It's not just this. This isn't just a payment. This is actually a payment for the services of regenerating the land. And there's this added benefit of, in the case of, we work with agroforestry crops, cacao. It's a cacao-based system. There are also commercial benefits for the farmer as well. So the gist of the program that we do is we have kind of promote this module that is a combination of hardwood trees, 100 per hectare, 120 hardwood trees or native shade trees combined with fruit trees as serving as the overstory, which is kind of the main engine of carbon removal. And then in the shade of those trees, cacao and banana, which provide food security and kind of long-term revenue stream from the cacao. And through the chocolate company that I'm also associated with, we also have a market for that cacao that pays, in this case, will be paying 3 to 4 times above what they would have otherwise earned, which is a big kind of game changer. But it all goes back to those initial payments. So as Tracy mentioned, unfortunately in Ecuador, the carbon law situation is challenging. It's on the cusp of being changed for the better. It's not quite there yet. So we don't sell carbon credits in the traditional sense, but what we do is we to the best of our ability, we've quantified the carbon benefits. We affix, and we basically quantified the carbon benefits. We've calculated the total amount of money that it costs for us to cover everything that's all the inputs required, seedlings, irrigation equipment, and then annual payments to farmers for the first 5 years, which is the key startup phase. And then we've kind of calculated our own carbon price based on that. To reforest a hectare of land with the payments of $4,500 over a 5-year period to the farmer, directly cash payments made in monthly installments, directly debited to their accounts, plus all the other inputs. It costs us about $7,400 per hectare. The carbon benefit we've calculated when we take into account, a suitable risk buffer, I think it comes out to about 191 tons of carbon over a 30-year period. My numbers are correct. And so the overall numbers, it comes out to about $39 per ton. I guess we call it the true cost of what this project takes. And so we've actually taken that model to funders directly and said, this is what we're doing. This is not just about carbon. This is about providing a reliable revenue stream to people in this community to regenerate their own land. This is what it costs. We're looking for support. And so we've been raising money that way. So that's a different kind of that overcomes the barrier to funding, at least at this scale. The other barrier that we faced is basically that we think about a lot is the barrier to success. We've done reforestation projects in the past. We've been involved in them. We've witnessed them in the region that haven't worked. And, there's a few reasons for that. For one is simply if people aren't committed to it, it's not, you can plant a tree in the ground. If you provided no aftercare, it's not going to survive. So the big thing is how can we ensure that, after the plant is put in the ground, that it's maintained for years. And in our particular region, the main barrier is just simply irrigation. And so you can plant shade trees, native hardwoods here without irrigation. But if involving cacao and banana, that will need irrigation. And so what we offer farmers is we cover half the costs of a full irrigation setup for everyone who wants to participate. We provide financing for that. So we basically we purchase all the necessary inputs. They commit to covering half of that cost. So that cost, their half is kind of debited, is discounted kind of very gradually over a 2-year period from the monthly payments that they make. So that suddenly gives them this ability to water and irrigate their parcels that previously didn't have that ability. That alone is a game changer. I mean, there's a lot of parcels of land that we've been working with that no one has even made an effort to try to plant something that has long-term benefits like cacao mixed with hardwoods, because there just wasn't a way to do that. Now there is. Even the investment in some of this irrigation infrastructure, it's not massive, but for someone who's earning on an average of $50 or $100 a month, in general, it's a very high barrier to entry. So we've eliminated that barrier to entry. We provide all the seedlings. So we're trying to give everyone everything they need for success. And then, of course, the payments are tied to the survival rates and the success of the seedlings. And so we do frequent monitoring, seedling by seedling, do tree censuses to make sure the trees continuing to grow. Whenever anyone encounters a problem with irrigation, we do our best to help solve that problem so that there's water flowing to these trees. So our goal is to, we've seen this in the past, reforestation projects, people plant, 1,000 trees in a hectare, and how many of those survive? Sometimes survival rates can be, 30%, 20%, 10% even. We aim for 90% survival rate. And then anytime a tree dies, doesn't make it, which happens, it's kind of part of the process. There's kind of rules in place for replacement planting. So ultimately, we're trying to produce these really successful parcels of, reforestation parcels. And then I guess the last barrier is just the barrier to permanent, the issue of permanence and the barrier to longevity. And the main deal there is the way that we've structured our payments is we've front loaded, taken all the income that would have been generated from carbon had the carbon market in Ecuador been active, take all that income and front load it for the first 5 years, because those are the key 5 years that require the most work for starting up changing the system and then getting those trees to maturity. That's also the period it takes for the cacao trees to begin producing. And so the idea is those payments start off strong, slowly taper down. And then by year 5, when the cacao trees become productive, we bring in the buyer. And then the money from the income from those cacao trees is basically equal to the payments for ecosystem services that were front loaded. So everyone's income kind of stays steady throughout the life of the project, basically throughout the life of the cacao trees. And that's going to extend for greater than 30 years. So that's been our journey. We're still figuring it out. We're in the second year. We're Last year was a pilot project. This year we're ramping up, trying to scale up. And that's probably going to continue for the next few years. And every year we learn more. So we're kind of at the beginning of it. But so far the success it's been really effective. We've, most farmers that we've worked with that are working in this project, their monthly income has doubled from it, which is massive impact in a place where people have there's very few economic opportunities here. It's one of the most impoverished parts of the country. So, that's been a success economically as well. Thanks, Tracy.
Thank you, Jerry. And it's certainly a really important model that involves, diverse activities where carbon is only one. And I think you also bring up a really important point about, the true cost of the carbon from that project is actually much higher than what we typically see on the carbon market. So thank you so much. So let's now sort of, I wanted to open it up and pose a set of questions and also just open it up to discussion. So you've all done a really great job listing and mentioning some of the key challenges that you're finding in your work. But I'd like to, kind of revisit that and maybe ask you to name maybe 2 to 3 of the most pressing challenges that you're seeing in your work in terms of, developing, implementing, or identifying high quality carbon offsets. So maybe if you could just name, you mentioned many, but if you can mention maybe sort of the top 2 or 3, even 4 if necessary, but the top 3 that you're really seeing in your work. Maybe why don't we start with you, Barb?
Okay, thanks. And Jerry and Liz, it's so inspiring to hear about the work that you're doing. Okay, so 2 challenges from the perspective of University of California as a buyer. And the thing that I think a lot about and that keeps me up at night is that, so from the perspective of a buyer, Liz and Jerry, you're doing this amazing work in the places where you're working. There are a lot of projects out there that probably would have gone ahead anyway. There are a lot of projects out there that are exaggerating, that the protocols are exaggerating the emissions reduced or removed. There are also a lot of projects that claim co-benefits but don't actually achieve co-benefits, and some that actually restrict forest communities' use of the forest. And how do we get from here where all of those projects are treated as equal because those credits are traded and each one is, this abstracted, represents 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent emissions reduced or removed. And it's very hard for a buyer like UC, which has a lot of capacity for analysis. It's even much harder for someone who goes to a website and wants to fly and is offered the chance to offset their emissions. How do we go from this system to a system that distinguishes or allows the buyer to distinguish or creates a market only for those high quality projects that really have the co-benefits and don't cause harm and are not exaggerated? And I think, one challenge is what I described, where the incentives in the market are for more volume rather than for quality. And I think a second challenge is the price, right? So Jerry, you're saying $39 per ton. I can go out there and buy a credit for $3, $4 per ton, much poorer quality. But how do we get from a market where, I can spend $3 to a market where I'm really paying the funds that is necessary to support real high quality emissions reductions?
Yeah, honestly, actually, Jerry, I'd love, maybe you should follow up on that. You've been reaching out to buyers, with a price of $39 per ton. How do they react? Maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a hard sell. If anyone is going to do kind of bargain shopping for carbon credits, nobody would want to support our project because, yeah, as Barbara said, there are a lot of projects out there for $3 to $4. Liz, you mentioned the Oaxaca project it's at $10, and that's where most of the industry is at. For us, I think for our project to be solvent, we're trying to charge what really goes into it. And then what really goes into it really is driven primarily by what it takes, our payments for ecosystem services need to exceed the opportunity cost for other activities. If they don't, then people won't join the project, and then we won't even have a project. No trees will go in the ground. And so we're very fixated on that. What's the opportunity cost? How can we raise enough money to cover that? And then how can we have enough money to make sure that these projects are successful? And that is a big challenge I think for the carbon industry as a whole. And Tracy, you know this, you and I are huge advocates of the social cost of carbon. There is a movement afoot for establishing kind of this, the Stiglitz-Stern numbers at $100 per ton. I mean, that would have a massive impact because suddenly that would free up that could potentially free up a lot of capital for projects that otherwise would not exist. And all of a sudden now there is this demand there's going to be enough funding and financing for projects that, so hopefully that comes about. I think the world is headed in that direction. And in the meantime, it's, I think, a little bit of almost like a PR game and an educational game. It's up to us to educate the public and the carbon offset consumer that, there's more at stake here. There's more that needs to go into it. So I think I see that as a big thing in the next few years in the carbon market, a challenge, major challenge.
Thanks so much for mentioning the importance of the social cost for carbon. And the social cost for carbon is the cost of damage associated with the emission of 1 ton of carbon. And in the United States, under the current Biden-Harris administration, the social cost of carbon is $51 per ton of carbon. If you add an equity weighting, that number can be 2 to 8 times higher than the social cost. Countries have a range of the social cost of carbon. It could be, in many cases, it's actually much higher than 51. But the idea is that if these projects were to have access to these much higher prices, we would see, I think, some much greater success for a lot of these projects, and I think really importantly, being able to address some of the main drivers of deforestation. The kind of large scale cattle ranching, the large scale soy production that we're seeing in places like Brazil. Currently, the low cost of carbon is insufficient at $2 and $5 and $3 per ton. It's insufficient to really change those activities. So I think the social cost is really key. But I think that even in the case of Mexico, I think is a really important case study and pilot for what you called the kind of relational and relationship carbon. But so maybe Liz, if you wouldn't mind, but what are some of the key challenges that you've seen in the Mexico case, the Oaxaca case?
Yeah, thanks. I also will just thank you, Jerry, for I've learned so much from what you had to discuss, and so thank you for that. So I think one of the things I'll just say that one of the roles that I play as well is I'm work with the Duke Office of Carbon Offsetting. We actually have a carbon offsetting office to select projects as well. So Barbara, I'll just reflect as well that our model is similar to the CAL system in that we do actually use a relationship model as well. where we really do attempt to purchase offsets from places where our students or faculty have been involved, where they can, because of their involvement, it brings benefit to the university for learning opportunities and research opportunities, but also because we can verify through our relationship with that project that there are all these other added benefits actually being produced as well. So just to say that that's a similar model. But there's, I think, Tracy, to your question about relationship carbon, I don't know that that's scalable. And I know that it's kind of a problematic word to use, but it's difficult to think about ways to capture what you were talking about, Barbara. And I apologize if I'm overgeneralizing what you said, but how do you actually certify, or what criteria do you use to measure such subtle things as the ways in which justice and equity is represented in the projects, the ways in which the additionality that is brought through improved forest management, improved governance, improved capacity within that community to manage their forests or to organize to manage their forests. These are things that are really difficult to measure, but that are the hallmarks of really sustainable, high quality carbon offset or forest-based carbon offset projects. It's really tough to measure that without having a nuanced a relationship with that project that can provide that nuance, right? And that nuanced understanding of its dynamics and its outcomes. So I don't know the answer to that. I think it is a challenge. And it would be great to hear your all's thought on that. Just one other thought too is I'm also working with projects in Peru it's a research project, so I don't have the same relationship as I do with ICICO in Oaxaca. But on this, the issue of risk and the risk that project implementers and participants are taking on, it is such a risky business to be in the forest-based carbon offsetting space and the majority of the risk is being taken on by participants and by project implementers. And that's financial risk as well as reputational risk, livelihoods risk, the ability to feed your family for the participants. I don't think that's discussed enough. And I think it is a justice issue as well. Absolutely. And one that we need to consider. There's all sorts of ways that people who are purchasing carbon offsets can de-risk their projects. And that's not available for project implementers or participants. So that's another issue that would be great to discuss as well.
Yeah, thanks so much, Liz. I think what you've been really clear about the importance of trust as an important element, a key element for justice and equity in the projects. And I'd ask you, are there other elements that you see that are required for carbon offsets to be aligned with climate equity and justice? Yeah,
I mean, I think what's difficult is a lot of the aspects that and this is just based on my experience with our offsetting project in Oaxaca, Mexico with ICICO. But a lot of the aspects that are required for it to be just or equitable and produce offsets that are viable, that do represent actual reductions in emissions and that also benefit the communities in which they're implemented, are things that are almost preconditions that are really difficult to establish. So the ability to have strong tenure over land on which the forest is being, their ability to make decisions about how they want to manage this land and to know that they will be able to continue to manage that in perpetuity. That's a really rare circumstance, as Barbara was noting, in tropical forests, especially. To have really strong governance and collective action, ability to act collectively at the local level to make decisions together, and to be able to, there's a lot of reasons why that is necessary for small holders or people who don't have very much land to be able to act as a group and to make decisions in an equitable, just way over how they want to see the project managed. And the other component is really that it requires a whole lot, I think, as Jerry was noting, it requires a whole lot of funding and capacity building and support up front. And that usually doesn't come through markets. In the projects that I've seen that have been successful, they've done that through funding from development organizations, foundations, from academic institutions, that in the case of ASECO, that was 7 years of that type of support before they actually had to engage with markets. So those circumstances are really unusual. And to find those, I think, is really tough. And Jerry, I'm just reflecting on what you said about trying to find that kind of funding through markets. It's tough, I think, to be able to ask markets to cover that when there are other cheaper alternatives out there.
So Jerry, other than funding, what are other elements and key elements that you think might be required to see more equity and justice through these types of projects, carbon offset projects?
Yeah, it's a good question. And in fact, thanks for bringing that up, Liz, about risk. And I've been feeling that risk, but I've never really looked at it that way until just now. But you're right. We've been having to hold back on how many people, how many farmers we can work with this year, because we are nervous that we're not going to have enough funding to honor our commitments to the farmers, because these are 5-year payments. And if, we commit to that and funding, we don't have funding to actually follow through with that, that's a massive failure on our part. It's total loss of trust forever with not just that person, but probably the entire community. And then also the farmers we're working with are also sharing that risk with us, because what if, they're changing their land use, they're changing their livelihood, they're depending on us, who are depending on other funders to come through with the funding. So it's it's a fragile chain. They're also depending on a chocolate company to, in a very competitive field of chocolate, in a growing field. The chocolate company is, yes, it's committing to purchasing their cacao in 5 years, but a lot of things could happen. As we've seen with the pandemic, there's all sorts of demand and supply shocks that we can't necessarily protect against. And so it's a risky business for everybody. And it's definitely a risky business if you're a funder, because, there's a lot of things that could prevent that carbon from actually being removed. So yeah, I think mitigating risk across the board is a major challenge that I haven't actually really been thinking about as much as that we probably should. I mean, I've just been feeling the stress. I haven't really been trying to figure out how to solve it. But yeah, so that's what I would add to that discussion.
Yeah. How about you, Barb? From your perspective, what are other key elements that you think would be required for carbon offsets to be better aligned with climate equity and justice?
Yeah. I imagine an alternative to our current offset approach. And I really appreciate what you've both been discussing about the challenge of the market, right? Like, Jerry, you need funds up front to get these projects off the ground. And the offset market provides funds ex post that are verified after the projects are already running and the credits, the reductions are verified. And, this race to the bottom with price. The difficulty with measurement. And I imagine an alternative where instead of where we see or we develop offset programs that instead of I feel like the offset market is going in two different directions. Like, there's all this discussion about creating exchanges. We just need to scale offsets. We need to create these exchanges, make it easier to trade credits, get more money flowing. But that's different and a totally opposite approach to, I think what we need is more relational, where the buyers develop a relationship with organizations that are doing amazing work on the ground. And instead of just buying these abstracted credits off of an exchange, really working with organizations that are doing good work, really vetting those organizations, building those relationships, being clear about what the effects are, sharing the risk by putting funds up front, and either paying the funds as social costs of carbon, like charging a fee and supporting a range of different projects, organizations, or estimating the emissions reductions and paying in proportion to that. Yeah, I put that forward as an alternative to this market, like going this market approach where we're headed.
Yeah, thank you so much, Barb. That is a really important alternative. I know that you're also a proponent of the kind of contribution model. Do you think you could maybe say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the contributions model is along the lines of what I was just proposing, and instead of sort of paying for credits that have happened or that represent reductions that have happened, putting money into, charging yourself a fee could be the social cost of carbon, putting that money into a fund, and then that gives you a lot more flexibility in what you could do with those funds to have the most impact that you can have. Yeah, that's the contributions approach, which is an alternative to the current offset approach.
How about you, Liz? What do you see as potential alternatives, given some of the challenges that we've seen with offsets? What might be some viable alternatives?
Well, I will say that's, I'll just second everything that Barbara said. So I think that's a great idea. It's to especially really be thinking about relational carbon. I like that idea a lot. And I have seen, certainly, I think it's maybe easier for institutions like universities that have not only a financial profit model, but a mandate also for education and for perhaps knowledge in the service of society, as like in the case of Duke University. So I think that may be easier in some cases than others, but I do think that that's a way to actually really to be able to connect with and support projects that are promoting just carbon, right? And equitable solutions and viable solutions that really are producing additional carbon offsets or offsetting additional carbon. I love Barbara's idea of having that be perhaps through a fund as opposed to a direct market relationship. I think that may be a way to take some of the profit motive or the profit pressure off of that process. I'll just say, I'll just second, maybe I'll just stop by seconding everything Barbara said.
And Jerry, how about you? Do you have more that you'd like to add?
I would just like to throw one kind of, it's an aspirational concept that I, and maybe a few other people who are watching this have picked up on it too. If you read Kim Stanley Robinson's book, The Ministry of the Future, he proposes and other people have too, the idea of carbon coins. So rather than, there's the carbon tax idea, which is, I think, could be very useful. But there's that could also be paired with, and this is kind of in terms, macro thinking, paired with a carbon reward. And this is a digital traceable currency, unit of currency backed by central banks. It's generated by the removal of a ton of carbon. And it's from a book that's, I guess you could call it a science fiction book, but it does have some support in the world of economics. There is somewhat of a precedent. I mean, central banks could do this, rather than backing a currency with gold as it used to be. It would be backed with something else that's physical, and it's carbon dioxide is a physical thing, and that could trigger. I mean, that would have a massive impact on it would change the incentive structure across the global economy. So. I'm sure there's definitely some challenges to that that are beyond the scope of this conversation, but I think it's something interesting to think about. And these are big ideas that I think we need to start looking at, because we need action needs to be taken. And I think currently the rate that we're on right now, change is so slow and incremental that it's we're not getting the job done as a species.
Thanks, Jerry. That's certainly I think critical for like shifting kind of broader economic systems to ones that are more regenerative and aligned with a kind of just transition. So I think that's actually a perfect place to end. And I definitely would like to thank you so much, Barbara, Liz, and Jerry, for your presentations. Thank you for this really rich discussion, and certainly thank you for the important work that you're doing in the world. And as far as the class is concerned, I hope you've enjoyed this final lecture of the module on climate justice for tropical forests. And so thanks again for your participation. And yeah, it's been really fantastic. So such a rich and very important conversation.